Welcome back to Insight Incorporated. James and I are going to dive into Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling tonight. Last week, we discussed his objections to Hegelian philosophy and his sort of clarifications on points that he thought Hegel may have been accurate, but not quite seeing the full picture. We dove into faith and what that looks like, but we didn't quite get to the bottom of Fear and Trembling's description of faith. And so tonight we'll look at the image of the night of faith versus the night of infinite resignation and discuss aestheticism and ethicalism and faithism. Those last two aren't isms in Kierkegaard's work, but in an effort to discover what it might look like to uh, live a life of faith and how important that is in a world such as this. So, James, would you like to frame it any type of way before we get into the Fear and Trembling text?
Well, I kind of want to go into the Fear and Trembling text a little bit before getting to the passage about the night of faith and night of infinite resignation.
Okay.
I do want to read the opening paragraph just because I just love it a lot. Um, just to get a better understanding of just where Kierkegaard's coming from. So um, he opens with, well, he has some preliminary text before this, but this is really the right when we get into the meat. The first section is called Speech in Praise of Abraham. So this is how he starts the whole book. He says, if there were no eternal consciousness in a man, if at the bottom of everything there was only a wild ferment, a power that twisting and dark passions produced everything great or inconsequential, if an unfathomable, insatiable emptiness lay hid beneath everything, what then would life be but despair? If it were thus, if there were no sacred bond uniting mankind, if one generation rose up after another like the leaves of the forest, if one generation succeeded the other as the songs of birds in the woods, if the human race passed through the world as a ship through the sea, or the wind through the desert, a thoughtless and fruitless whim, if an eternal oblivion always lurked hungrily for its prey, and there were no powers strong enough to wrest it from its clutches, how empty and devoid of comfort would life be? But for that reason, it is not so. And as God created man and woman, so too he shaped the hero and the poet or speech maker. The latter has none of the skills of the former. He can only admire, love, take pleasure in the hero. Yet he too, no less than the hero, is happy. For the hero is, so to speak, that better nature of his in which he is enamored, though happy that it is not himself, that his love can indeed be admiration. He is a spirit of remembrance, can only bring to mind what has been done, do nothing but admire what has been done. He takes nothing of himself, but is jealous of his charge. He follows his heart's desire, but having found what he sought, he wanders round in front of everyone's door with his song and his speech, so that all can admire the hero as he does, be proud of the hero as he is. That is his achievement, his humble task. This is his faithful service in the hero's house. If he remains thus true to his love, if he struggles night and day against the wiles of oblivion, which would cheat him of his hero, then he has fulfilled his task. He is united with the hero who in his turn has loved him just as faithfully. For the poet is, so to speak, the hero's better nature, ineffectual certainly as a memory is, but also transfigured as a memory is. Therefore no one who was great will be forgotten. And however long it takes, even if a cloud of misunderstanding should take the hero away, his lover still comes, and the more time goes by, the more faithfully he sticks by him. No one shall be forgotten who was great in this world. But everyone was great in his own way, and everyone in proportion to the greatness of what he loved. For he who loved himself became great in himself, and he who loved others became great through his devotion. But he who loved God became greater than all. They shall all be remembered, for everyone becomes great in proportion to his expectancy. One becomes great through expecting the possible, another by expecting the eternal. But he who expected the impossible became greater than all. They shall all be remembered, but everyone was great in proportion to the magnitude of what he strove with. For he who strove with the world became great by conquering the world. He who strove with himself became greater by conquering himself. But he who strove with God became greater than all. Thus there was strife in the world, man against man, one against thousands, but he who strove with God was greater than all. Thus there was strife upon the earth. There was he who conquered everything by his own strength, and he who conquered God by his powerlessness. There was one who relied upon himself and gained everything, one who, secure in his own strength, sacrificed everything. But greater than all was the one who believed God. There was one who was great in his strength, one who was great in his wisdom, and one who was great in hope, and one who was great in love. But greater than all was Abraham, great with that power whose strength is powerlessness, great in that wisdom whose secret is folly, great in that hope whose outward form is insanity, great in that love which is hatred of self. And so that's how he opens introducing Abraham as the greatest hero of faith, which is the greatest hero of all. Um, and then he goes to describe the life of Abraham. Um, I do want to let that breathe. I think that's just profound um, ways to kind of fixate the meditation upon the father of faith. And just to show how and to elevate and put in proper context how high of a passion faith is. Um, that there are, that's not to say that, being a tragic hero, sacrificing all for the greater good isn't great. That conquering or mastering this or that is not great as well. But each man is great in proportion to what he strove with. And he who strove with the world, he who strove with himself is great in proportion to that. But he who strove with God is greater than all. Um, and that's kind of the call that Kierkegaard is kind of making on individuals. That, like, you're great in proportion to what you love, what you strive with, what you um, expect. And the greatest expectancy, the greatest striving is ones that have to do with you and your personal relationship with God. And I think that's just a beautiful framing.
Yeah, it is extremely poetic, and I think, as you mentioned, that it is just a deep understanding of that reality that you can strive as a person and what it is that you strive with, because the world is inherently relational. uh it then dictates your greatness, right? Like the result is then variant based on what you put your effort into. I think that I've heard that concept maybe expressed in a less deep way. That, like, God is good, the world is bad, but some of my favorite people are created by God, and they don't know who He is to strive with Him in the first place. But they do strive, and excellently, and are heroic, and uh, or even tragically heroic. And yeah, I guess for my part, I would say that in some sense, even those lesser things that we strive with indicate that there is the greatest of all things to strive with, that or the greatest one that we can strive with. Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit of a crossover here with some Nietzschean thoughts about how Christians are weak for their lack of striving. And I don't know that Nietzsche took that to necessarily the greatest place, but I can concur on some points. Last episode we brought up Christian nihilism. Like, what's the point of striving if Jesus did, strived for it all, and will control our future and all of that? It's just taken care of. There's a lack of, like, potency there, like that we are sort of uh what's the word, emasculated, that we what's the point, there's nothing else to do. But in reality, this striving with God is what is set before us, as our ultimate task, duty, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's talked about when Jacob wrestled with God. It's spoken of later on by another prophet of that story. There's a story where Jacob, he's running from his brother and he's about to meet him the next day. And then he has this one night where some man tackles him and starts wrestling him and then eventually breaks his hip, but he still holds on. And he says, I will not let go until you bless me. And it says that Jacob won that fight with God. He was wrestling God, but it's because he submitted to him and wouldn't let go until he blessed him. That was him winning, even though, you know. So when Kierkegaard says that Abraham's strength was his powerlessness, that's like a Christian um, rendering of, in my
Yeah,
weakness, I am made
Paul said that.
strong in this. Yeah, yeah. And so then Kierkegaard does this just to properly frame why Abraham is greater than all. He says, had Abraham wavered, he would have renounced it, his claim to the promised son, his claim to Isaac. He would have said to God, so perhaps after all, it is not your will that it should happen, that I will give up my desire. It was my only desire, my blessed joy. My soul is upright. I bear no secret grudge because he refused it. He would not have been forgotten. He would have saved many by his example, yet he would not have become the father of faith. For it is great to give up one's desire, but greater to stick to it after giving it up. It is great to grasp hold of the eternal, but greater to stick to the temporal after having given it up. Um, and so that's like the whole thing, that the paradox of infinite resignation, but then doing a double movement where in giving it up, you actually lay hold of it again in the temporal sense, in the finite sense, but yet not losing the fact that you also grabbed hold of the infinite.
Yeah,
That's why he's the father of
I want to say
faith.
something here because we don't have the context of what we're going to read in a few minutes here. But when Kierkegaard lays out his experience of meeting the knight of faith and being blown away by him, he's incredibly mundane, and yet he is fully alive and fully experiencing life, and every aspect of it is, just sensational, and he delights in it, and he's uh, unflappable. And this is what Kierkegaard is talking about later, and I've read this, but as you were saying it kind of clicked for me. So when you say things like infinite and finite, and faith and resignation, and these words can be uh, immaterial, unintelligible, but that's all he's getting at, is that there is a way of living your life continuously that allows you to grasp what your experience is in an infinite sense in the finite. So as you're living your life, you
Hmm.
fully grasp the infinite value of what it is that you are resigning to to the infinite. And I don't know if I'm helping anybody here trying to clarify, but it's like uh
Yeah.
it's that everyday experiential level of life that I think it gets discounted very often by very devout ethical knights of resignation that say, you know, uh, I am not doing this thing because I know that in the afterlife I will have a reward. It's sort of an eternal marshmallow test. But I do believe that Kierkegaard is touching on some truth here, that you cannot simply resign it. The fullness of your life is not found in simple resignation. It's simple. He says it's difficult, and it is, but it is a sort of striving with the ethical rather than striving with God. And so there's like there's a step change there. The ethical is one thing, uh, and not it is not that absurd quality of God. You know what I mean?
Hmm. Yeah, and another thing to clarify is that he even claims the pseudonymic writer, which I think probably even Kierkegaard says, like, not that I've necessarily obtained this.
Mm.
I'm not saying that I have this. I'm showing how high of a call, especially Abraham's example. Abraham's example is the highest expression of it, aside from Christ himself. And so it's to the point of it is to show how truly, like, not to try to trivialize faith. Is he's trying to redeem the proper understanding of faith, and by extracting these truths from the highest expression of faith any man has ever expressed, which is Abraham in this instance, it's also not trying to make salvation like unobtainable, and therefore it's this high thing that it's not contradictory to the simple gospel. So when we're talking about faith in this sense, I don't want it to come across as um, like you to be saved requires some monolithic deed like what Abraham did, um, as if it's a system. That's
Uh-huh.
the whole point. It's not meant to be like that. It's meant to. This is all a polemic to show that when people denigrate faith and chalk it up to something that is trivial, they strawman it and then they explain away its necessity, and that it's like really it's just like a childlike sickness that you need to get over as quick as possible. But really, it's the highest passion. That's Kierkegaard's trying to show just how high of a passion faith is. And so it's not the point is it isn't really um what's the word? What's the study of salvation?
Soteriology.
Yeah, it's not we're not extracting soteriological truths here. We're just simply trying to frame faith in a way that does it proper service. And even at that, it's not like this is an exhaustible thing. It's just simply to make the point that, you know, don't fall prey to the folly that often faith is talked about as if it's some light or trivial or easy or skill even. But really it's something much
Mhm.
greater, and it encompasses your whole entire life. Um, and it has direct impacts upon your experience in life.
Yeah.
It's not just some abstract thing.
Uh,
Um,
I wa
and so when we're talking
I just
about,
wanted to interject here
yeah,
about the title being Fear and Trembling coming from that Philippians passage. That verse doesn't make sense in a soteriological system, like system theory, because you it's worked out. Like we transpose some sort of like maybe it has to do with sanctification in some kind of sense within that system, but I think that it's less about secure your salvation from God with fear and trembling. That's I think that's one interpretation of work out your salvation with fear and trembling, and more of uh this sense of like,
live it out.
yeah, exactly. And I want that to be tacked on to what you just said, because it is an important clarification. And at the same time, I think like I want to counter clarify that it because these things talk about faith, it doesn't mean that faith in the Abrahamic sense is not salvific. It's different than that. It's post salvation moment or something like that. It's like it's both and paradoxical, huh? So it's like
Hmm. Yeah.
it's necessary to hold both, and not even in tension, but just like simultaneously. Hey, uh, I have faith that Jesus is who he said he is. That's the preceding paragraphs before the verse about fear and trembling, and then because of that, that informs the way that I live my life, almost irrationally, because of the relationship that you have with God, who is, in this case, the absurd, capital A. He doesn't make sense. It is paradoxical for the finite me to have an infinite God to be in relationship with him. And so, anyway, I just wanted to say it is salvation is that's a thing, and soteriology that all has we did 3 episodes on it. And then like
Yeah, yeah.
I think even those episodes were sort of a proto conversation to this one, because it was like trying to get at what does it look like to live your salvation out in fear and trembling, because like you lose so much of what your life could be by settling at that point to say I have resigned it all to the afterlife. Like that is that is simply not what Abraham is demonstrating.
Yeah, but it is good to clarify that even Kierkegaard says like to resign everything into the eternal is great, but greater still is to, after resigning it, get it back in the finite.
Hmm.
And that takes faith. That's a
Hmm.
miracle. That's a marvel. Um, and without God, that's impossible. But with God, all things are possible. And anyone who comes to him must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So this is this is more of a, yeah, not a system of understanding how to relate, but more to stretch you to recognize that this is something that's meant to be lived out, not just and wrestled with and grappled with. And it's hard and heavy and frightening, but also the most rewarding and joyful and peaceful, restful at the same time. That's the paradox even there too. Um, yeah. So this is all touching on the fact that it's it's easy to, when you generalize, you try to, you rob it of how personal it's meant to be. But at the same time, you can't put it in a personal way that every single person is going to convey it. That's why we speak in these generalities and systematic ways. Is because the principle is still relevant, but the principle manifests in nuanced ways within each individual. And that's what we're getting at here. This is how it was manifested in the individual of Abraham. And it's very nuanced. It's meant to be Abraham's act of faith. It's not everyone's called to do this, but the principle is still relevant. Um, but at the same time, it takes on um, a deep expression that no one else could, because no one else was asked to, and no one else was empowered by God to do that. Because that verse, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to do for his good pleasure. So um, that signifies that God's the one who's going to give you the desire and then the power to do the thing that is your personal expression of faith, just as he did with Abraham and how he does with all the saints. And so, um, yeah, that's just to try to start this meditation and the framing that Kierkegaard does. Um, Kierkegaard has this quote. I'm not going to read it in context. I just loved it a lot. Quote said, "For he who loves God without faith reflects on himself, while the person who loves God in faith reflects on God." And I think even just that out of context is just a bar. It shows how magnificent and how vast the absolute actually is in your perception. When you're walking in faith, you're more reflecting upon the power of God than you are of yourself. And that's the whole thing about the religious causes you to be more self forgetful than the ethical ever could, because you're not resting and placing your trust and faith in the universal, but you're tracing it in the eternal, placing it in the eternal. So he who loves God without faith reflects on himself, while the person who loves God in faith reflects on God. Um, I just love that. So to transition into now, finally, the passage that we are going to spend time in, um, I'm going to read this to transition into it. And then we'll start to actually get into the night of faith, the night of resignation. And so he starts that section with this: would it not be best all the same to stop with faith? And is it not disturbing that everyone wants to go further? When people nowadays, as in fact variously announced, will not stop with love, where is it they are going? To worldly wisdom, petty calculation, to paltriness and misery, to all that could put man's divine origin in doubt? Would it not be better to remain standing at faith, and for the one who stands there to take care not to fall? For the movement of faith must be made continually on the strength of the absurd, though in such a way be it noted that one does not lose finitude, but gains it all of a piece. I, for my part, can indeed describe the movements of faith, but I cannot perform them. When learning how to make swimming movements, one can hang in a belt from the ceiling. One may be said to describe the movements all right, but one isn't swimming. Likewise, I can describe the movements of faith, but when I am thrown into the water, although I may be said to be swimming, for I'm not among the waders, I make other movements. I make the movements of infinity, while faith does the opposite. Having performed the movements of infinity, it makes those of finitude. Lucky the one who can make those movements. He performs a marvel, and I should never tire of admiring him. Whether it's Abraham or the servant in Abraham's house, whether a professor of philosophy or a poor serving maid is for me absolutely immaterial. I look only at the movements. But those I do indeed look at and let myself be fooled neither by myself nor by anyone else. The knights of infinite resignation are readily recognizable. Their gait is gliding, bold. But those who wear the jewel of faith can easily disappoint, for their exterior bears a remarkable similarity to what infinite resignation itself as much as faith scorns, namely the bourgeois Philistine. And for the record, this was written before bourgeois and all that had its connotations. This is just like the layman, the noble, the well off man. And a Philistine is someone who's just like not really, just like takes in culture very passively and um, unsophisticated. So bourgeois Philistine is like someone who's noble but unsophisticated. Um, so someone who's making these movements can appear as easily disappoints, for their exterior bears a remarkable similarity to what infinite resignation itself, as much as faith scorns, but yet it's almost indistinguishable because it is well placed in the finite, though it's movements of the infinite. You're still enjoying the temporal and the eternal simultaneously, um, and so he goes on to say he doesn't really have very many examples, but he can imagine what it's like to meet this guy. And here's the passage that I wanted to read. It's kind of a long one, but um, he says, "As I said, I haven't found such a one. Still, I can very well imagine him. Here he is. The acquaintance is struck. I'm introduced. The moment I first set eyes on him, I thrust him away, jump back, clasp my hands together, and say half aloud, 'Good God, is this the person? Is it really him? He looks just like a tax gatherer. Yet it is indeed him.' I come a little closer, watch the least movement in case some small, incongruous optical telegraphic message from the infinite should appear. A glance, expression, gesture, a sadness, a smile betraying the infinite by its incongruity with the finite. No. I examine him from top to toe in case there should be some crack through which the infinite peeped out. No. He is solid through and through. His stance vigorous. It belongs altogether to finitude. No smartly turned out townsman taking a stroll on a Sunday afternoon treads the ground with surer foot. He belongs altogether to the world. No petit bourgeois belongs to it more. One detects nothing of the strangeness and superiority that mark the night of the infinite. This man takes pleasure, takes part in everything, and whenever one catches him occupied with something, his engagement has the persistence of the worldly person, whose soul is wrapped up in such things. He minds his affairs. To see him at them, you would think he was some pin pusher who had lost his soul to Italian bookkeeping. So attentive to detail is he. He takes a holiday on Sundays, he goes to church. No heavenly glance or any other sign of the incommensurable betrays him. If one didn't know him, it would be impossible to set him apart from the rest of the crowd, for at most his hearty, lusty psalm singing proves that he has a good set of lungs. In the afternoon, he takes a walk in the woods. He delights in everything he sees, in the thronging humanity, the new omnibuses, the sound. To run across him, you would think he was a shopkeeper having his fling, such is his way of taking pleasure. For he is not a poet, and I have sought in vain to prize out of him the secret of any poetic incommensurability. Towards evening, he goes home, his steps tireless as a postman's. On the way, it occurs to him that his wife will surely have some special little warm dish for his return. For example, roast head of lamb with vegetables. If he were to meet a kindred spirit, he can continue as far as Osterport, so as to converse with him about this dish with a passion befitting a restaurateur. As it happens, he hasn't a penny, and yet he firmly believes his wife has that delicacy waiting for him. If she has, to see him eat it would be a sight for superior people to envy, and for plain folk to be inspired by, for his appetite is greater than Esau's. If his wife doesn't have the dish, curiously enough, he is exactly the same. On the road, he passes a building site and meets another man. They talk together for a moment. He has a building raised in a jiffy, having all that's needed for that. The stranger leaves him thinking that must have been a capitalist, while my admirable knight thinks, yes, if it came to that, I could surely manage it. He takes his ease at an open window and looks down on the square where he lives, at everything that goes on, a rat slipping under a board over the gutter, the children at play, with a composure befitting a 16-year-old girl. And yet he is no genius. I have tried in vain to spy out in him the incommensurability of the genius. He smokes his pipe in the evening. To see him, you would swear it was the cheesemonger opposite vegetating in the dusk. Carefree as a devil may care, good for nothing. He hasn't a worry in the world, and yet he purchases every moment that he lives, redeeming the seasonable time at the dearest price. Not the least thing does he do except on the strength of the absurd. And yet, Yes, it could drive me to fury out of envy if for no other reason. And yet this man has made and is at every moment making the movement of infinity. He drains in infinite resignation the deep sorrow of existence. He knows the bliss of infinity. He has felt the pain of renouncing everything. Whatever is most precious in the world, and yet to him, finitude tastes just as good as to one who has never known anything higher. For his remaining in the finite bore no trace of a stunted, anxious training, and still he has this sense of being secure to take pleasure in it, as though it were the most certain thing of all. And yet the whole earthly form he presents is a new creation on the strength of the absurd. He resigned everything infinitely and took everything back on the strength of the absurd. He is continually making the movements of infinity, but he makes it with such accuracy and poise that he is continually getting finitude out of it, and not for a second would one suspect anything else. It is said that the dancer's hardest task is to leap straight into a definite position, so that not for a second does he have to catch at the position, but stand there in it in the leap itself. Perhaps no dancer can do it, but that night does it. The mass of human lives, disheartened lives of earthly sorrow and joy, these are the sitters out who will not join in the dance. The Knights of Infinity are dancers too, and they have elevation. They make the upward movement and fall down again. And this too is no unhappy pastime, nor ungracious to behold. But when they come down, they cannot assume the position straight away. They waver an instant, and the wavering shows they are nevertheless strangers in the world. This may be more or less evident, depending on their skill, but even the most skilled of these knights cannot hide the vacillation. One doesn't need to see them in the air, one only has to see them the moment they come and have come to earth to recognize them. But to be able to land in just that way, and in the same second to look as though one was up and walking, to transform the leap in life to a gait, to express the sublime and the pedestrian absolutely, that is something that only the Knight of Faith can do, and it is the only one and only marvel.
That would be a beautiful life, and even Kierkegaard admits that he has not attained it. Um, I think that it's just making me think about uh, the idea of. I spoke a little bit about it in the Jordan Peterson episode about the the burning bush, that it is on fire but not consumed. That you would be fully alive. That is the human being fully alive. That there's a grasping of the infinite in every finite thing, and there is no, I don't know, there's no lighter touch, than the person of faith. That he described it in the beginning, that it looks like he's obsessed with these things because he's so proficient and invested in them, but yet he doesn't care. Right,
Passionate.
passionate, but he doesn't care that he doesn't have any money and his wife didn't have dinner ready, and like it's just a light touch. It's a very graceful and beautiful thing. um I heard recently that you could tell a novice, someone who's inexperienced at something, uh because they do too much. They do too many things. And I've experienced this recently. I've been mowing lawns with my buddy, and I'm a novice at that, not very good at the professional lawn care business. And so uh, I never know what's acceptable to let go of. Like, is that strip of grass okay to leave, or do I have to keep going? Should I go further? And so there's a lot of like reining me in, because I'm trying to do too many things because I'm unsure of sort of what is perfect, what is good. And anyway, yeah, in Kierkegaard's description there, you see a person who does not do too much. He holds each thing lightly with an open hand. If it's this way, it's great. If it's that way, it's great. But yet, he still wants it to be one way, and then can resign it the next. Yeah, it's inspiring, and what did he say? Uh, Inspiring and envy inducing, like the meal that his
Yeah.
appetite.
And it's also infuriating because it's not like dressed up and super impressive and it's super remarkable. And it looks actually very plain and meek and unimpressive. That's the most infuriating part of it. And I think obviously Jesus being the knight of faith, um, I do think you see glimpses of that through the New Testament. Just the way that he can go to a tax gatherer's banquet and enjoy himself, and he can be mistaken as one of them. And yeah, it's just interesting. And, you know, I always kind of think like, what was his life the first 30 years like? You know, like he's just a dude. He had a job and had a family and just went about human things. And yeah, it's easy to start to imagine one way or another, and you do it disservice. It is a mystery. I like to leave it at that. But still, he what you can intuit is that he enjoyed his creation. He enjoyed life. Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
it's just
Even all
interesting.
throughout the Gospels, he enjoyed
Um,
food. Uh, in a
yeah, and rest.
Yep,
He took
yep.
naps. You know, like
Those are delightful things. I enjoy them as well.
yeah. Um, and so this next passage is very. Even that last passage was, you know, very long and prosaic, and even this can be. And I don't know. I haven't mastered it well enough to know. Like, okay, we can skip that paragraph or read that paragraph. So bear with me in my possible fumblings through. I'm trying to keep it concise. I don't want to just turn this into an audiobook, but um, he says, "Yet this marvel can so easily deceive. I will therefore describe the movements in a particular case, which can illustrate the respective relationships to reality. For it is these that everything turns on." And that's the existential framework that Kierkegaard says. Like, if it's something you can't actually live in or bring it to a personal thing, then there's no point in even considering it. So I like that he, you know, he's kind of talking about an abstraction, but then he's like, okay, let's try and make it more personal and relatable because that's the most important. If you can't actually relate to it personally, then you're wasting your time. It's a
Yeah.
distraction.
On that note, I read recently that Kierkegaard had either an engagement or just some sort of courtship, whatever they were doing in the 1830s, uh, with a woman,
Hmm.
and uh, it did not culminate in marriage. And so it was like broke off, they broke up, whatever happened. And so um, that definitely informed the way that I read this. I don't know for a fact, but maybe even especially as he's writing under a pseudonym, he's expressing some of his more authentic feelings about that situation, which is like you'll hear it as James reads it. But I just wanted to give that sort of like hook so that you're paying attention and can see sort of what
Yeah.
Kierkegaard is expressing here from a very personal place to him, you know.
And yeah, it's kind of understood that he more associates with the night of resignation. Right? He resigned his marriage, and actually on his deathbed, he said that he regretted. He was going into the ministry. He's going to become a pastor, and he said he regretted that he didn't go into ministry and regretted that he didn't get married. Um, but you know, he writes in either or. Sorry, this is a thing. He opens with the aesthete. I might just read it because it's just like, oh my gosh, it's heavy, but I don't know if I should read it actually. Um,
Sum it up.
Maybe I will. I think well, he just puts it super concisely. So he says this in an ecstatic lecture of either or. It's the aesthete speaking. So it's not necessarily meant to be like a this is his reflections on life. It's just meant to be like a polemic. But he says, if you marry, you will regret it. If you do not marry, you will also regret it. If you marry or if you do not marry, you will regret both. Whether you marry or you do not marry, you will regret both. Laugh at the world's follies, you will regret it. Weep over them, you will also regret it. If you laugh at the world's follies, if you weep over them, you will regret both. Whether you laugh at the world's follies or weep over them, you will regret both. Believe a girl, you will regret it. If you do not believe her, you will also regret it. If you believe a girl or you do not believe her, you will regret both. Whether you believe a girl or you do not believe her, you will regret both. If you hang yourself, you will regret it. If you do not hang yourself, you will regret it. If you hang yourself or you do not hang yourself, you will regret both. Whether you hang yourself or you do not hang yourself, you will regret both. This, gentlemen, is a sum of all practical wisdom. It's just like, dang, dude. So that's the more, depressive aspects of Kierkegaard's writing, and embracing just like the burden of
Yeah.
existence. Like, no matter what, you're going to wrestle with despair. You're going to wrestle with regret. You're going to wrestle with anguish. You're going to wrestle with loss. And it's not meant, you can try to hide away in some form of abstract philosophy, but you're just distracting yourself from what really
Mm.
matters. Um, and there's inherent contradictions in all of them. No matter which way you go, there's going to be a contradiction. There's going to be an unsettled thing. And it's not even like faith resolves it. It's just that you're actually able to transcend it. But even that is doing a disservice to the point. It's unintelligible what it does, but it does marvelous things. Um, and the finite. It's not just like a faith is like, oh, okay, yeah, I can go through this deep anguish. I know God will make up for it and reward me for my suffering in the hereafter. It's like, no, it does have immediate consequences as well. Not that that's not true, but it also has immediate consequences as well. Anyways, so he's now going to create uh, an example of how um, he's creating like a hypothetical situation and then compares and contrasts how the Knight of Infinite Resignation acts and how the Knight of Faith acts. And they're very close, but at the same time, the faith man of faith goes beyond. Um, so here's how the relationship goes. A young lad falls in love with a princess. The content of his whole life lies in this love. And yet the relationship is one that cannot possibly be brought to fruition, be translated from ideality into reality. The slave of misery, the frogs in life's swamp naturally exclaim, such love is foolishness. The rich brewer's widow is just as good and sound as much. Let them croak away undisturbed in the swamp. This is not the manner of the Knight of Infinite Resignation. He does not renounce the love, not for all the glory in the world. He is no trifler. He first makes sure that this really is the content of his life, and his soul is too healthy and proud to squander the least thing on getting drunk. He is not cowardly. He is not afraid to let his love steal in upon his most secret, most hidden thoughts, to let it twine itself in countless coils around every ligament of his consciousness. If the love becomes unhappy, he will never be able to wrench himself out of it. He feels a blissful rapture when he lets it tingle through every nerve, and yet his soul is as solemn as his who has emptied the cup of poison and feels the juice penetrate to every drop of blood. For this moment is life and death. Having thus imbibed all the love and absorbed himself in it, he does not lack the courage to attempt and risk everything. He reflects over his life circumstances. He summons the swift thoughts that, like trained doves, obey his every signal. He waves his rod over them and they rush off in all directions. But now, when they all return as messengers of sorrow and explain to him that it is an impossibility, he becomes quiet. He dismisses them. He remains alone and he performs the movement. If what I say here has any meaning, the movement must take place properly. For the knight will then, in the first place, have the strength to concentrate the whole of his life's content in the meaning of reality and a single wish. If a person lacks this concentration, this focus, his soul is disintegrated from the start, and then he will never come to make the movement. He will act prudently in life, like those capitalists who invest their capital in every kind of security, so as to gain on the one what they lost on the other. In short, he is not a knight, meaning he doesn't just commit to the one even if it's risky, even though it costs him everything, he still commits wholly, um, and he concentrates on this commitment, this movement. Secondly, the knight will have the strength to concentrate the whole of the result of his reflection into one act of consciousness. If he lacks this focus, his soul is disintegrated from the start, and he will then never have time to make the movement. He'll be forever running errands in life, never enter the eternal. For at the very moment he is almost there, he will suddenly discover that he has forgotten something and so must go back. The next moment he will think it possible, and that is also quite correct, but through such considerations one never comes to make the movement. Rather, with their help, one sinks ever deeper into the mire. So the knight makes the movement, but what movement? Does he want to forget the whole thing? Because in that too there's a kind of concentration. No, for the knight does not contradict himself, and it is a contradiction to forget the whole of one's life content and still be the same. He has no inclination to become another, seeing nothing at all great in that prospect. Only lower natures forget themselves and become something new. Thus, the butterfly has altogether forgotten that it was a caterpillar. Perhaps it can so completely forget in turn that it was a butterfly that it can become a fish. Deeper natures never forget themselves and never become something other than they were. That was a bar. I highlighted that one.
I was just thinking that we talked in an earlier episode about the way that it was the Dostoevsky about the way that God places his faith in us, but sort of in him in us or something like the potential of a human being to be what their deeper nature can be when fully loved and fully played out, uh, freed. And yeah, I just think that thought just kind of rushed back into my mind. I was like, wow, yeah, he really does. You could see if you track God's movements through the scriptures, through the life of Jesus, through the work of his spirit today, that he is unrelenting in this non-contradictory faith in the human endeavor. It's sort of a non-human endeavor, if you get what I'm saying. Like it's his great drama played out in the world. And so he takes that responsibility on himself, but also gives us a share of that responsibility, or maybe shares that responsibility with us. And we can we can only take up that yoke with him, to use Jesus's words. We could take up that yoke through his sort of encouragement and desire for us to be a part of that, but not without it. And so, anyway, I just was thinking that uh, the night of resignation uh, sees the goodness of God's plan, but doesn't quite participate in it. So that faith is like one step further. He participates in half of it, but to fully join in would be to not keep forgetting things and turning back and sink further in the mire, like you just read from Kierkegaard.
Yeah. And even I would add too, like it's not only God's working through the world, but it's God working in the world through individuals. Like this takes
Fear and
place
trembling,
in the individual, in each individual.
to will and to
Yeah.
do according to his good
Um,
pleasure.
so the knight will remember everything, but the memory is precisely the pain. And yet, in his infinite resignation, he is reconciled with existence. His love for the princess would take on for him the expression of an eternal love, would acquire a religious character. He transfigured into a love for be transfigured into a love for the eternal being, which, although it denied fulfillment, still reconciled him once more in the eternal consciousness of his love's validity, an eternal form that no reality can take from him. Fools and young people talk about everything being possible for a human being, but that is a great mistake. Everything is possible spiritually speaking, but in the finite world there is much that is not possible. This impossibility the knight nevertheless makes possible by his expressing it spiritually, but he expresses it spiritually by renouncing it. The desire which would convey him out into reality, but came to grief on an impossibility, now bends inwards, but is not lost thereby nor forgotten. At times it is the unconscious working of the desire in him which awakens the memory. At others it is he himself that awakens it, for he is too proud to want to let the whole content of his life seem to have been but a fleeting affair of the moment. He keeps this love young, and it grows with him in years and beauty. On the other hand, he needs no finite occasion for its growth. From the moment he made the movement, the princess is lost. He needs none of this erotic titillation of the nerves at the sight of the loved one, etc. Nor does he need, in a finite sense, to be continually making his farewell, for his memory of her is an eternal one, and he knows very well that those lovers who are so eager to see one another one more time to say farewell are right to be eager, right to think it will be the last time. For as soon as may be, they will have forgotten one another. He has grasped the deep secret that even in loving another one should be sufficient unto oneself. He pays no further finite attention to what the princess does, and just this proves that he has made the movement infinitely. Here we have the opportunity to see whether the movement in the individual is proper or not. There was a person who also believed he had made the movement, but time went by, the princess did something else. She married, say, a prince, and his soul lost the resilience of resignation. He knew then that he had not made the movement correctly. For one who has infinitely resigned is enough unto himself. The knight does not cancel his resignation, he keeps it, just as young as in the first instance. He never lets it go simply because he has made the movement infinitely. What the princess does cannot disturb him. It is only lower natures who have the law for their actions in someone else, the premises for their actions outside themselves. If, on the other hand, the princess is similarly disposed, there will be a beautiful development. She will then introduce herself into that order of knighthood, whose members are not admitted by ballot, but which anyone can join who has the courage to admit him or herself, that order of knighthood which proves its immortality, but making no distinction between man and woman. She too will keep her love young and sound. She too will have overcome her agony, even though she does not, as the songs say, lie by her Lord's side. It keeps going, but that's pretty much the point. Like, it turns this finite desire into a spiritual one that's eternal and rests in the eternal sense, in the spiritual sense. And so it's still just as real, but it's no longer finite. The same desire has the same properties, but it's placed in the eternal. It's placed in God, knowing that this desire will spiritually be fulfilled um, in the infinite, but it can never take place in the finite. That's infinite resignation. So, say if Abraham did sacrifice Isaac, and he believed that he wasn't going to get him back, he would have infinitely resigned and said, "Well, I know I'm going to get him back," and turns the promise of God not into one that has finite implications, but recognizing, no, this is just a spiritual implication. I will spiritually have this son, and I will spiritually get him back in the infinite. Um,
Yeah. I was just going to ask you if you have anything that you're willing to share in your own life where you might be able to say that you're living up to this night of infinite resignation, because I think the point that he made at the end there is so crucial, and has many more examples of the false move of resignation, where you're resigned in the moment to the current status of things, but then when uh, there is an un unpleasant development that is sort of like uh what you were hoping wouldn't happen because of your move of faith or resignation, uh it reveals in you this mistake that you said you were resigning infinitely, but actually uh you were not. And anyway, so I was just going to ask you, do you have anything that's like sort of a concrete example of that? Because I would say more people step falsely in that direction in a short-term sense than are able to. I just wanted to elevate the status of the night of infinite resignation, because I feel like I've been playing it off against faith, and it sort of dulls in comparison to the night of faith, but it still is very impressive to be a night of infinite resignation.
um, I have a faint idea, but I can't think of if it's like a 1-to-1 ratio. Um, when I before I went into 10th hour, there's that phase where I was in Colorado Springs and I was, working, and is in that time my story where I was saying like I'm starting to think that I don't want to live for my own kingdom. I want to live for the kingdom. And so I don't want to build up my own white picket fence. I'd rather resign that desire. Um, and then find it in the spiritual sense, find it in the spiritual sense of uh, operating for the kingdom, for Jesus in the kingdom, for the uh, promised kingdom that is to come, but that is also here. That's the part of it that I didn't really get. I still don't really, but um, and so in what I thought I resigned that. I think there was a when I went to go leave the ministry. Um, I can't necessarily attribute as to what developments caused this to arise in me, but there was a recognition of like, um, I'm like 20, 23, and I'm still kind of aimless. I don't really have an occupation that's consistent, and I feel the desire I need to. I see my friends getting married, and my older brothers who are married and have kids, and they're talking about the need for occupations and needing to provide. And I had like this weird thing of like, no, I need an occupation, I need a career. Um, and it kind of shows I didn't properly actually resign my need for a finite occupation or to fulfill me. Um, and so I think that's what kind of motivated me to then go to school to go pursue a career. Um, and in so doing, I've kind of went into the mire with this backtracking and this. I'm sure there's many other examples I can give, but that's one that comes to mind in this moment. And it's one that I'm even currently working through, and one that I would say I haven't necessarily, because that's the other thing too is this whole talk of having faith and then having what you resign manifest in the finite. Um, there's a temptation to cheapen it as if I can, because when I was in that mentality of, I was a intern, a pastoral intern, um, growing towards the direction of what I expected, which was to become a pastor, and then uh, some in some way becoming disillusioned, um, mostly because I had a misconception upon um, conforming to his likeness. I had a misconception of what holiness and glory, partaking the glory of Christ, was. And so I decided, I fell back to the universal. I kind of fell out of the paradox by trying to perfect what Jesus started in the spirit by perfecting it in the flesh, which is, falling back to legalism. That's what Paul talks about a lot, even in Galatians. In fact, in that season, I was reading Galatians. That's what caused me to realize, like, well, I have now, I haven't actually resigned the thing. I'm actually just trying to find a different finite means of fulfilling this desire in a way that's not actually miraculous. It's really rational. I'm falling back to rationality. I'm not operating by virtue of the absurd. I'm operating by virtue of what makes the most sense and what brings the most sense of security. Um, and so, with that, working out sanctification, I was attempting to sanctify myself by trying to deny and cut away parts of my personality. And I was really wrestling with um, personality, character, and identity. Like, how do these three things really correlate? I went through existential crisis
Mhm.
again, and I was reading. I actually was reading this book, I think, during that time too, and that's how I'm even connecting these terms to this season. I think is because it came to me again. I read this before when I was in Colorado Springs, actually, um, and maybe that's what initiated my existential crisis. Then this book has been
Yeah,
haunting me
yeah.
for a couple of years now, uh, and every time I've read it, it's like, yeah, I'm cheapening. I'm disguising, dressing up faith as if it's a rational exercise, intellectual exercise, rather than a true dependence upon God that is radical and scary, um, and making it to a place where it doesn't really demand me to surrender. It demands me to bolster my own efforts with Christian verbiage. Um, and so, yeah, I wouldn't say I've actually come to a place where I have made the movement of infinite resignation in that regard. And maybe in many regards, I kind of fall back to the aesthetic side of things rather than, I don't really. I have had a season where I've fallen into the universal and became very, very legalistic in that sense, but I have more proclivities to go back to the aesthetical, to the pleasure seeking, to the um, trying to relinquish myself from boredom via tickling my own fancy. Um, and I think that's something I'm wrestling with currently, actually. Um, that's what has the most appeal to me. I really love beauty, really love um, things that involve passion, like art, like things, but I can have an inordinate affection when it comes to those things. And um, yeah, I'd say I'm still struggling with infinitely resigning, um, denying myself and picking up my cross and following Him. Uh,
Yeah.
in some places, I feel like I have. but then I have a moment of weakness where it's like the complete absurdity. It's kind of like when Peter, when he's walking on water, he's all walking and then he realizes what he's doing. And then he's like, wait, this is crazy. And then he falls into the water because the absurdity becomes absurdity again. Um, but when you're in faith, the absurdity is no longer absurdity. Um,
Yeah, I have a lot of elements of my life that mirror the season that you described, and like kind of one for one, being a pastoral intern, being disillusioned, having misconceptions, all of it. Um, I think that it's interesting to think about the people that may be listening to this, who are also young adults looking to find their place in the world. And I'm just fascinated by the role of faith in fulfilling that. You at the end you mentioned you have a tendency to fall back on the aesthetic. There's a line from Viktor Frankl about if a man has no meaning, he will seek to uh, fill his desire with pleasure. Um, and I think that that is the way of the aesthetic individual. And then Chris Williamson has a inverse Frankel's law that says if a man uh, has no pleasure, he'll seek to fill it with meaning. And I think that's sort of like the ethical person. But then above that and between the faithful person is that infinite resignation where it's like you're not quite to the creative end of things, but it is the precedent, the presupposition of the night of faith that you would infinitely resign these things. And it's just so difficult when you're 25, 23, whatever, and you don't have a clear path forward. Like I feel like the world is set up in such a complicated way as far as figuring out how to turn whatever education that you manage to get out of a broken system into some form of sustenance on the other end. And it's very complicated to think about these things in any type of way that makes sense, because I think this is where I find the profound truth of the absurd and faith transcending the absurd by confronting it and encountering it and then converting it into something less than like that makes more sense. Uh because the world is so complicated that it is absurd. That's a fact. And when you live your life, there needs to be some element of faith that you're placing in something that is absurd. Like, I'm going to get married. That's insane. Like how are you going to convince this person that they
yeah.
should commit to you? Like, there is an absurd element to that. I know certainly in my story, uh 4 years ago or something, nobody should have married me. Maybe even still, but like I I have been married, and that's great, and it's going well, and I love it as much as I
Miracle.
yeah, absolutely, and I love it as much as I thought that I would, and so that passion remained. But I was going to share my story. I've said it before, but I had this resignation of um the idea of a wife, and I stepped forward and pretty much definitely was a false resignation. Like I basically did not believe at all that anything was going to happen, but I did step forward with full concentration. I think that was the key. It was sort of like a pragmatic resignation. I was not pursuing a relationship in any way because I was heading the opposite direction of sort of my version of the things I would need to get a relationship. And yet that was the path that God laid out before me, uh, to both develop me into the person that would be capable of getting married to someone, desirable as a marriage partner, and it also just very practically like that's where I met my wife, was on that path forward into the absurd. And so I think that in some ways that was the ground or foundation of our relationship, that I uh like in sort of a very deep way, that I was willing to step into the absurd, was compelling to her. And yeah, anyway, so I that's my personal example, and it worked. It happened, like I resigned the thing to eternity. Like, I don't know, this will never happen. I'm spending another 9 months not developing myself, is what I was thinking, and yet I was simultaneously doing the opposite of what I thought I was doing. Um, so yeah, I think that not only in a spiritual sense, like in reference to God, having faith in Him, but like it is that it's having faith in God, that He's working through this call of faith, because we each have that area of our life that we are afraid to step across the gap, that we don't know what we're going to land on the other side. And and that transcendent move requires that we let go of the solid ground that we think that we're standing on.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of fear and trembling.
Yeah,
A lot of unintelligibility. I don't know.
absolutely.
It's a tricky thing. Um, so he says, in infinite resignation, there is peace and repose. Anyone who wants it, who has not debased himself by, what is still worse than being too proud, belittling himself, can discipline himself into making this movement, which in its pain reconciles one to existence. Infinite resignation is that shirt in the old fable. The thread is spun with tears, bleached by tears. The shirt is sewn in tears, but then it also gives better protection than iron and steel. Um, a defect of the fable is that a third party is able to make the material. The secret in life is that everyone must sew it for himself. The remarkable thing is that a man can sew it just as well as a woman. In infinite resignation, there is peace and repose and consolation in the pain. That is, if the movement is made properly. I could easily fill a whole book with the various misunderstandings, awkward positions, and slovenly movements I have encountered in just my own slight experience. People believe very little in spirit. It is precisely spirit that is needed to make this movement. What matters is its not being a one sided result of dire necessity. The more it is that, the more doubtful always is that the movement is proper. To insist a frigid, sterile necessity is necessarily present is to say that no one may experience death before actually dying, which strikes me as crass materialism. Yet in our time, people are less concerned with making pure movements. Suppose someone wanting to learn to dance said, for hundreds of years now, one generation after another has been learning dance steps. It's a high time I took advantage of this and began straight off with a set of quadrilles. One would surely laugh a little at him, but in the world of spirit, such an attitude is considered utterly plausible. What then is education? I thought it was the curriculum the individual ran through in order to catch up with himself, and anyone who does not want to go through this curriculum will be little helped by being born to the most enlightened age. Infinite resignation is the last stage before faith, so that anyone who has not made this movement does not have faith. For only in infinite resignation does my eternal validity become transparent to me, and only then can there be talk of grasping existence on the strength of faith. And so then now he's laid out how infinite resignation is a necessary condition or prerequisite for true acts of faith. And he says, let us now have the knight of faith make his appearance in the case discussed. He does exactly the same as the other knight. He infinitely renounces the claim to the love which is the content of his life. He is reconciled in pain, but then comes the marvel. He makes one more movement, more wonderful than anything else, for he says, I nevertheless believe that I shall get her, namely on the strength of the absurd, on the strength of the fact that for God all things are possible. The absurd is not one distinction among others embraced by understanding. It is not the same as the improbable, the unexpected, the unforeseen. The moment the knight resigns, he was convinced of the impossibility, humanly speaking. That was the conclusion of the understanding, and he had energy enough to think it. In an infinite sense, however, it was possible, through renouncing it as a finite possibility, but then accepting that possibility is at the same time to have given it up. Yet for the understanding, there is no absurdity in possessing it, for it is only in the finite world that understanding rules, and there it was and remains an impossibility. On this, the knight of faith is just as clear. All that can save him is the absurd, and this he grasps by faith. Accordingly, he admits the impossibility, and at the same time believes the absurd. For were he to suppose that he had faith without recognizing the impossibility with all the passion of his soul and with all his heart, he would be deceiving himself, and his testimony would carry weight nowhere, since he would not even have come as far as infinite resignation. Faith is therefore no aesthetic emotion, but something far higher, exactly because it presupposes resignation. It is not the immediate inclination of the heart, but the paradox of existence. Thus, that a young girl in the face of all difficulties rests assured that her desire will be fulfilled, in no way means that her certainty is that of faith, even if she has been brought up by Christian parents and perhaps gone for a whole year to the pastor. She is convinced in all her childlike simplicity and innocence. This assurance, too, ennobles her nature and gives her a preternatural dimension, so that like a worker of wonders, she can charm the finite powers of existence and make even stones weep. While on the other hand, in her distraction, she can just as well run to Herod as to Pilate and move the whole world with her pleas. Her conviction is ever so lovable, and one can learn much from her, but one thing one does not learn from her: how to make movements. Her certainty does not dare look the impossibility in the eye and the pain of resignation. I can see then it requires strength and energy and freedom of spirit to make the infinite movement of resignation. I can also see that it can be done. The next step dumbfounds me. My brain reels. For having made the movement of resignation, now on the strength of the absurd, to get everything, to get one's desire whole and full, that requires more than human powers. It is a marvel. But at least I can see this, that the young girl's conviction is mere frivolity, compared with a faith that is unshakable, even when it sees the impossibility. Whenever I want to make this movement, I turn giddy. At the same moment, I admire it absolutely, and yet in that same instant, an immense anxiety seizes my soul. For what is it to test God? And yet, this is the movement of faith and remains that, however much philosophy, in order to confuse concepts, will have us suppose that it has faith, however much theology wants to sell it at a bargain price.
Bar.
Yeah. I love that he shows just how high of a cost faith truly is. And also points out how much philosophy and theology wants to sell it at a bargain price. Make it a comfortable and comprehensible walk rather than the dreadful and um, contradictory aspect, nature that it is, the walk of faith. Um, so, thus, working out your fear or your salvation with fear and trembling. That's why it requires fear and trembling, because it it comes at a high price. Um, and true hope is hope that is experienced in the face of despair. I think that's something that could be said. Like, true hope is informed by the despair. Like, you can't have true hope without understanding despair. Um, so we kind of see with John in Revelation. I bring it up a lot because it had a profound impact on me. One day, um, in Revelation, he is called up to heaven and he's granted the ability to see what's going on in the throne room. And I kind of want to read it. Um, He says, "After these things, I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I had heard, like the sound of a trumpet speaking with me, said, 'Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after these things.' Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was standing in heaven, and one is sitting on the throne. And he who was sitting was like a jasper stone and a sardius in appearance. And there was a rainbow around the throne, like an emerald in appearance. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and upon the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white garments and golden crowns on their heads. Out from the throne came flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder. There were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was something like a sea of glass, like crystal. And in the center and around the throne, 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind. The first creature was like a lion, and the second creature like a calf. The third creature had a face like that of a man, and the fourth creature was like a flying eagle. And the 4 living creatures, each one of them having 6 wings, are full of eyes around and within. And day and night they do not cease to say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God, the Almighty, who was and who is to come. And when the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who sits on the throne, to him who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders will fall down before him who sits on the throne, and will worship him who lives forever and ever, and will cast their crowns before the throne, saying, Worthy are you, our Lord and our God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and because of your will they existed and were created. And he says, I saw on the right hand of him who sat on the throne a book written inside, and on the back sealed up with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaim with a loud voice, Who is worthy to open the book and to break its seals? And no one in heaven and on earth or under the earth was able to open the book or to look into it. Then I began to weep greatly, because no one was found worthy to open the book or to look into it. And that encapsulates that moment of despair. Like no one in heaven, no one on earth, no one under the earth, there's nothing that was worthy to open this scroll. And if it just stopped there, that's life without Jesus. That's life without the cross. It's life without the resurrection. Uh, and so just this moment of despair is real. He says, I began to weep greatly. Like this dread impacted him so heavily. This despair like sunk into the depths of his being. Um, and one of the elders said to me, Stop weeping. Behold, the lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has overcome so as to open the book and its 7 seals. And I saw between the throne with the 4 living creatures and the elders a lamb standing as if slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God, sent out into all the earth. And he came and took the book out of the right hand of him who sat on the throne. When he had taken the book, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each one holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, saying, Worthy are you to take the book and to break its seals, for you were slain and purchased for God with your blood men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth. And that's what kicks off Revelation. But just like um, there is no true basking in the hope of Jesus without experiencing the weeping that comes from the despair of life. Um, and these things go hand in hand. We try to, that's just one verse. We read right over it and like, look, like stop weeping. But this moment was like an eternal moment. Um, and I think that's important to not just gloss over and jump to the good news. Um, it's important to recognize the need of despair, the need of, um, yeah, the need of despair to fully appreciate hope. The need to know the bad news in order to actually appreciate the good news. And that's one that evokes the existential crisis.
Mm.
And so um, that's the importance of existentialism in regards to the gospel. And it has to be a personal experience. It's not just an abstract reality. Um,
Yeah. And even just to distill it
that's
from John's, you know, uh, revelation, his, what do they call that? Not Armageddon, his apocalypse. Yeah.
apocalypse.
Uh, which is obviously legitimate and true. And maybe even like that infinite absurd. Like, wow, that's crazy. But to bring it back to those everyday finite movements that we make and we can make in faith, uh, I think that there's all of that in the story of Abraham. And so that's what Fear and Trembling gets into, analyzing that as though it really happened because it did. He's saying you can't have that confusion of concepts of philosophy and you can't have that bargain price of faith in theology uh, when you look at Abraham's legitimate life, where he woke up that morning and said, "Come on, Isaac, we're going to Mount Moriah," and that's a 3-day journey. And they packed the food for it, and they loaded up, and they rode out, and they sat together while Abraham is going through this internally in the presence of his son, whom he believes that he will retain despite the fact that he's obeying God's call to sacrifice him. And I was just thinking about the relevance, the cultural relevance of the time for Abraham. Like, he's surrounded by people that sacrifice their children to their gods for their own survival. You know, these were fertility rituals, or like in both senses. So both, I mean, agricultural, or like, you know, having more kids. Uh, and so these rituals were demanded of the people by their gods and priests and whatever. And so they had a whole structure that was like, you sacrifice your children so that you remain, uh, you know, alive, so that you can continue to develop your kingdom here on earth, your family, your nation, whatever. And so God, up until this point, is calling Abraham out of that stuff, and he's leading him away into a much different sort of separate life. And Abraham has many movements of faith in that direction, but this is sort of the pinnacle of it. And so the cultural relevance of child sacrifice would have been something that's in Abraham's milieu. You know, it's not completely foreign. Maybe in the same way that today, nobody, I don't think, really considers sacrificing their 13-year-old son or whatever to be a normal practice. You know, it's not going to come up on a Tuesday like, oh, sorry, buddy. But it's more like it's more typical of his time. And so he's being beckoned by his God, who's led him in all of these different and various absurd ways. And yet now the God that led him differently than the culture seems to be contradicting himself in aligning with it. And Abraham says, "No, I know what he has promised me before." And he's received Isaac as the gift of God according to his blessing through a miraculous conception in his own right for Isaac, that they were like 100 years old each, him and Sarah, Abraham and Sarah. And so all of this is flooding Abraham's actual days, hours, minutes as he's moving towards the mountain to obey God in this way. That's so deeply contradictory to what he believes God's ultimate mission to be. He cannot figure it out rationally, and yet he continues to serve him. And I think it has to be on the basis of his relationship with him, that he knows God. And so, like, you can't know God fully, but you can't know a person fully even, but you know the essence of them. You know that you can project some sort of, it's not rationality, but there's like a sense. When you have faith, there is a sense of what will be on the other side. Like, you have no idea what it will be, but that it could be good necessarily. I mean, it has to be a part of that movement, I think. And so anyway, I see that this despair is. I wanted to comment on what you said about how that's life without Jesus. And I think so many people live in that world around Abraham of child sacrifice. And even today, like, lots of people make the connection between abortion, but I think that there's so many people that, you know, it's a common movie trope of the dad or the mom who have not lived out their full potential, and then it's a real life thing. They subjugate their children to their dreams of success in whatever. Basically, they
Mm.
haven't strived well with whatever thing they're trying to strive with, and so they're not that great, and they want their kids to be great. And it's sort of in a, you know, it's very abstract, but it is sacrificing their child to their own desire for greatness. And uh, yeah, it's just a sick, twisted, broken thing that continually manifests in humanity because of that lack of awareness of God and his character. And so Abraham has this transcendent moment of faith, movement of faith, where he obeys God in this ridiculous, upside down, twisted kind of way. And it actually is the thing that allows him to encounter the truest nature of God. And he reveals further more that of the covenant afterwards. I think, did you read that? I'm pretty sure you did. Uh, when we read the passage about the sacrifice, it's like he adds to it the fullness of your descendants will be like the stars, they'll be like the sand, there, like you will bless all nations, all of these things that were sort of encoded in that first portion of the covenant. But now it's like everything that you thought I could have possibly meant by what I said to you before, now you see even more of the fullness of it, if only in part, because Abraham doesn't know uh like David, he doesn't know the next sort of lineage that will connect all the way to Jesus, and then the people that will connect to Jesus and be a part of his family in the future. So it's all still out there in the absurd, and yet it's clarified because of the momentous encounter with the absurd, capital A, uh, that is only possible by sort of believing that that is the way that God is. Because that's what I wanted to say about Christian existentialism, or some whatever you would call Kierkegaard's philosophy, is like God is unintelligible to us, and yet that's sort of the New Testament insistence, is that he became intelligible to us to some extent, and yet requires us to leap in faith into the unintelligibility of himself for the fullness of that relationship to commence, right? For it to be commensurable.
Mm.
And I think that that's a very exciting and intriguing proposition to me, that as absurd and unknowable as God can be, it is through the absurdity and the unintelligibility that he calls us into experience of himself. And so we move from a simple infinite resignation, simple, to that movement of faith by trusting in his nature, by saying, this world is lacking inherent meaning, but I believe that there is one who is writing a story, who is the author and perfecter of the faith. And I believe he's working in me to will and to do according to his good pleasure. And you play into that world. I think that's what it means to live in the kingdom of God. Like it's not necessarily rational, it's not necessarily intelligible, but I do think there's an intuition, like a spiritual inclination to believe
Mm.
in the God that is maybe even above the absurd. It's just sort of that intermediary layer that we can't see through, we can't rationalize through. And when we break through, we're in the presence of the one who can open the scroll, the one who takes away the weeping at the suffering of existence.
Mm. Wow. Amen. I'm going to close up this thought, I think, at least reading through Kierkegaard's thing. He's talking about through resignation, I renounce everything. This movement is one I can do by myself. When I do not do it, that is because I am cowardly and weak and lack the enthusiasm and have no sense of the importance of the high dignity afforded to every human being to be his own censor, a dignity greater by far than to be censor general for the whole Roman Republic. This movement is one that I make by myself, so what I win is myself and my eternal consciousness, and a blessed compliance with my love for the eternal being. Through faith, I don't renounce anything. On the contrary, in faith, I receive everything, exactly in the way it is said that one whose faith is like a mustard seed can move mountains. It takes a purely human courage to renounce the whole of temporality in order to win eternity. But I do indeed win it and cannot in all eternity renounce that, for that would be a self contradiction. But it takes a paradoxical and humble courage then to grasp the whole of temporality on the strength of the absurd, and that courage is the courage of faith. Through faith, Abraham did not renounce his claim on Isaac. Through his faith, he received Isaac. That rich young man, by virtue of his resignation, should have given everything away. But once he had done so, the night of faith would have to say to him, "On the strength of the absurd, you shall get every penny back. Believe that." And these words should by no means be a matter of indifference to the once rich young man. For if he gave his possessions away because he was bored with them, then his resignation was a sorry state. Um, he's talking about the rich young ruler in that instance when Jesus tells him to give up all his possessions and follow me. Um, he actually, his disciples then say in that story, "Well, what about us? We've left our parents, we left our wives." And Jesus says, "Anyone who has left father and mother, even his own household, will get them back tenfold um, in this life, as well as persecution." So that's showing even Jesus' words um, further encapsulate this teaching of having faith actually does have finite consequences. It's not just a infinite resignation to the eternal, and I will get it in a spiritual sense, but actually, after you make that movement, you make the movement of also making heaven on earth by your faith and by virtue of the absurd, by virtue of God. And so that's kind of like the metaphor that informs pretty much the whole entire. He parallels that with Abraham. Showing that Abraham is the knight of faith who does that. Um, and then he goes on in the book to point out other issues of to further undermine Hegel's assertion that the universal is the highest. He points out how Abraham contradicts this. The first problem is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? And he says that if there isn't, then Abraham is lost. Meaning, at the ethical, I think I explained that before. The ethical is suspended in service to the absolute. When you serve the absolute, the ethical is suspended, but then even it's fulfilled in relation to the absolute. The second problem is hold on. Is there an absolute duty to God? And if there is an absolute duty to God, then it transcends Hegel's assertion that everyone's absolute duty is to the universal. And then the last one, was it ethically defensible of Abraham to conceal his purpose from Sarah, from Eleazar, and from Isaac? And that's when he talks about the unintelligibility of walking the faith. Um, so those are the three issues that Kierkegaard uses to undermine the philosophical assertion that the universal is what one ought to have absolute duty to. He says that God transcends that. So therefore the system breaks down and it can't be actually lived in. Faith and the system are not compatible. Um, in some instances, in matters of acting out faith. And in fact, the system becomes a temptation that tempts you out of walking out your faith. Um, so that's kind of the whole point of Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. So to conclude this this episode, I kind of want to end where Kierkegaard ends his book, because though the minutia has to do with issues with Hegelian philosophy, the ultimate thesis is that faith is a passion that one isn't meant to move past or try to go beyond via philosophizing or even theologizing. But it's meant to be a passion lived and lived for your whole life and pursued your whole life. Um, so he writes this in his epilogue. Once, when the spice market in Holland was a little slack, the merchants had some cargoes dumped at sea to force up the price. That was a pardonable, perhaps necessary stratagem. Is it something similar we need in the world of spirit? Are we so convinced of having reached the heights that there is nothing left but piously to believe we still haven't come that far, so as at least to have something to fill the time with? Is it this kind of trick of self-deception the present generation needs? Is it to a virtuosity in this it should be educated? Or has it not already perfected itself sufficiently in the art of self-deception? Or is what it needs not rather an honest seriousness which fearlessly and incorruptibly calls attention to the tasks, an honest seriousness that lovingly fences the task about, which does not frighten people into wanting to dash precipitously to the heights, but keeps the task young and beautiful and charming to behold, and inviting to all, yet hard too, and an inspiration to noble minds, since noble minds are only inspired by difficulty. Whatever one generation learns from another, it can never learn from a predecessor the genuinely human factor. In this respect, every generation begins afresh, has no task other than that of any previous generation, and comes no further, provided the latter didn't shirk its task and deceive itself. This authentically human factor is passion, in which the one generation also fully understands the other and understands itself. Thus, no generation has learned from another how to love. No generation can begin other than at the beginning. The task of no later generation is shorter than its predecessors. And if someone, unlike the previous generation, is unwilling to stay with love but wants to go further, then that is simply idle and foolish talk. But the highest passion in a human being is faith. And here no generation begins other than where its predecessor did. Every generation begins from the beginning. The succeeding generation comes no further than the previous one, provided the latter was true to his task and didn't betray it. That this sounds worrying is not, of course, for the generation to say, for it is indeed the generation that has the task, and it has nothing to do with the fact that the previous generation had the same task, unless that particular generation, or the individuals in it, presumed to occupy the position to which only the spirit that governs the world, and which has the endurance not to grow weary, is entitled. If that is the kind of thing the generation begins to do, it is perverted. And what wonder, then, if the whole of the existence should look perverted to it? For surely no one has found life more perverted than the tailor in the fairy tale who got to heaven in his lifetime, and from there looked down on the world. So long as the generation only worries about its task, which is the highest it can attain to, it cannot grow weary. That task is always enough for a human lifetime. When when children on holiday get through all their games by noon and then ask impatiently, "Can't anyone think of a new game?" Does this show that they are more developed and advanced than children of the same or previous generation, or who could make the game they already knew last the whole day? Or does it not rather that those children lack what I would call the good-natured seriousness that belongs to play? Faith is the highest passion in a human being. Many in every generation may not come that far, but none comes further. Whether there are also many who do not discover it in our own age, I leave open. I can only refer to my own experience, that of one who makes no secret of the fact that he has far to go, yet without therefore wishing to deceive either himself or what is great by reducing this latter to a triviality, to a children's disease which one must hope to get over as soon as possible. But life has tasks enough, even for one who fails to come as far as faith. And when he loves these honestly, life won't be a waste either, even if it can never compare with that of those who had a sense of the highest and grasped it. But anyone who comes to faith, whether he be greatly talented or simple minded, makes no difference, won't remain at a standstill there. Indeed, he would be shocked if anyone said this to him. Just as a lover would be indignant if someone said he had come to a standstill in his love, for he would reply, "I'm by no means standing still in my love, for I have my life in it." And yet he too doesn't come any further, not to anything else. For when he finds that out, he has another explanation. And that's how he closes the book, which I think is the most beautiful defense of faith and the most honest eh, articulation of faith. Um, that actually puts in proper respect that it is a task for a lifetime and it is difficult. Therefore, that's why it takes a noble mind, because only noble minds are attracted to the difficult, and yet it's the most satisfying and most passionate, most uh, enrapturing of endeavors. And it's one that you have to begin from the start. No, you can't build off of someone else's progress. You can't even utilize someone else's faith for your own. It has to be your own. Um, and that was the cry that Kierkegaard made in Denmark, who was in a culture of Christians and they were born Christians and they inherited their parents' faith. He's saying that's an impossibility. And so those who have such a poor view of faith, it's no wonder that they think that they need to go further. And no wonder why the world looks so poor to them is because um, they view the highest passion as poor. So of course the whole world looks cheap.
Hmm. Yeah, strikingly similar situation for the American church, I believe. Cultural Christianity has overtaken a more authentic faith lived out, like Kierkegaard has been describing throughout this episode. Yeah, and it firmly positions faith as a mode of being, rather than a set of doctrines or uh, mere beliefs. Like a
Yeah, abstractions.
intellectual assent to some sort of formulation of how the world works, but rather it's a deep existential movement form that takes shape in the person of faith. And uh yeah, it's very exciting stuff. That's a lot more hopeful,
Yeah.
a lot more engaging, a lot more experiential than the dusty doctrines of cultural Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah. When I said the whole make what did I say? Make
Yeah,
evangelical, let's redeem it.
yeah.
I was thinking like, dude, we could make a mega hat,
Oh
bro.
yes,
Make
yes,
evangelicalism great again.
yes.
Dude.
uh
Make it passionate
yeah,
again. No,
I'm
I'm just
good.
kidding.
Just make Jesus
Yeah.
the king again. Yeah.
Yeah, no, amen. I wanted to read that work out your salvation with fear and trembling in context. And I wanted to also read another passage in Philippians to close us
Okay.
out, kind of leave us with something to chew on in light of all that we've talked
Sweet.
about, in terms of infinite resignation and also uh, making the movements of faith by virtue of the absurd. Philippians chapter 2, he starts off. Therefore, if there's any encouragement in Christ, if there's any consolation of love, if there's any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Purity of the heart is to will one thing. Um, Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interests of others. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. For this reason also God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow, of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and that every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to do for his good pleasure. Um, and so, even to put into context the difficulty of what we're talking about here, that working out your salvation, fear and trembling, is informed by the pattern that Jesus gave us to walk out, which is to humble yourself and be obedient even unto the point of death, to esteem others as higher than yourself and be a bondservant. Um, and being of the same mind, have this attitude in you which was in Christ Jesus. And it's only by the Spirit who dwells in you that you're able to both will and do for his good pleasure, do what is pleasing. It says only by faith that you can please God. It says that in Hebrews. Um, and then he says, finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same thing again is no trouble to me, and it is a safeguard for you. Beware of the dogs, beware of the evil workers, beware of the false circumcision. For we are the true circumcision who worship in the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh. Although I myself might have confidence even in the flesh, if anyone else has a mind to put confidence in the flesh, I far more. Circumcised the 8th day, of the nation of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to the righteousness which is in the law, found blameless. But whatever things were gained to me, those things I have counted as loss for the sake of Christ. More than that, I count all things to be lost in view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them but rubbish, so that I may gain Christ, and may be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own derived from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which comes from God on the basis of faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being comforted, being conformed to his death, in order that I may attain to the resurrection from the dead. Not that I have already obtained it or have already become perfect, but I press on so that I may lay hold of that for which also I was laid hold of by Christ Jesus. Brethren, I do not regard myself as having laid hold of it yet. But one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Let us therefore, as many as are mature, have this attitude. And if in anything you have a different attitude, God will reveal that also to you. However, let us keep living by the same standard to which we have attained.
Yeah. I think that speaks
Yeah.
beautifully of that growth edge of faith that is ever present and the lack of attaining that Kierkegaard felt. He's like, I totally get the night of infinite resignation. I can figure that out. I can think of it. I could see that it's possible, but the night of faith, that's way beyond what I can conceive of. And that is how faith is in each one of our lives, that we would always have that opportunity to step forward into a further and deeper relationship with God through whatever it is that is absurd in the moment to us. And there is always necessarily something absurd, or we're not paying attention, like that girl that he described.
So he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. And that's the whole working out salvation. It's like the salvation that he has actually already made manifest in you. You then manifest it through acts of faith. Um, we do not live by what we see, but we live by faith.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we see contradicts what we believe a lot of the time. And we move past the contradiction via strength of the absurd. And we are empowered to believe in such an absurd thing only by he who works in us both to will and to do for his good pleasure.
Yeah, man. This was a good one. I'm glad for it. Glad for your passion for Kierkegaard and the way that you've allowed it to affect you. And yeah, I look forward to the stories that we get to hear of, well, maybe just me, but of the way that God resolves these things in your life as you seek to uh, be upended and interrupted by the absurd and make those leaps of faith.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll keep you posted.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, man.
Not that I've obtained, but I look forward to for the prize of the upward call of Christ Jesus.
Yes.
So I can lay hold of that for why he lay hold of me. That's may that be the cry of my life.
Yeah. All right.
Amen.
See you next week.
All right. This is great. Yeah. Till next time. I love you.
Love you too. Bye-bye.
Yes. You said it.